All right, great. Welcome everybody to this event. So glad to have you here. My name is Jeff Sebo. I direct the NYU Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy, which is hosting the event, and I will be the host of the event. So really looking forward to having a conversation with you today about artificial consciousness. I can start just by telling you a little bit about the center, and I can then introduce our special guest and tell you a little bit about the format for the talk today, and then we can give the stage over to Anil and he can give his talk. So the NYU Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy is a research and outreach and field building center here at New York University that examines the nature and intrinsic significance of non-human minds. So we ask questions about, for example, the consciousness and sentience and agency and moral status and legal status and political status of invertebrates and AI systems and other non-humans whose mental capacities and moral significance are very important, but also very difficult to understand. And we do that through research, through events like this one, also public and in-person events, and outreach and field building activities. And so if you have more interest in our work, please check out our website. You can sign up for our mailing list. I will also note that we regularly do events with co-sponsorship from the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, as well as the Center for Bioethics. So thank you, as always, to those centers for your support and collaboration. Now, with that in mind, we have a great event today. It will be a talk by a wonderful speaker I will introduce in a moment, followed by questions, comments, objections, discussion from you. So just a note about how that will go, and then I can introduce the speaker. What we will do is start with a talk, and during that talk, you can enter questions and comments, objections, contributions of any kind in the Q&A tab on Zoom, not in the chat, but rather in the Q&A tab. And then once we enter the back half of the event, when we can have an open conversation, I will present your questions, comments, objections, contributions to the speaker by reading from the entries that have been added to the Q&A tab. So please feel free to add those anytime throughout the session. Okay, now, with that in mind, it is my great pleasure to introduce Anil Seth. Anil is professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience and director of the Center for Consciousness Science at the University of Sussex. He is also co-director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Program on Brain, Mind, and Consciousness and a European Research Council Advanced Investigator. He has published more than 200 research papers and has been recognized by Web of Science over several years as being in the top 0.1% of researchers worldwide. His 2017 TED Talk has been viewed over 15 million times. In 2023, he was awarded the Royal Society Michael Faraday Prize, and in 2024, Prospect Magazine listed him as one of the top 25 global thinkers. His book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, was a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller and named Book of the Year for 2021 by many periodicals. And I can add personally that this is a great book and you should read it. So thank you so much again to everyone for being here, and now to Anil for joining us and speaking with us. Oh no, you could turn your camera
Oh,
on.
I thought I'd
Joining
turned
us
it on.
and
I managed to turn it off
speaking
again.
speaking with us about artificial consciousness. So whenever you are ready, feel free to share your screen and take it away.
Wonderful. I'll do that. Thanks so much for the very kind invitation, Jeff, and congratulations on your new book too, which I'm looking forward to reading. So let's see. Hopefully now everybody can hear and see me fine. I'm going to continue assuming that that's true, and somebody will tell me if it isn't.
I can
So yeah,
confirm.
great. So thank you again for the invitation. Yeah, my talk today is going well. I feel a bit bad because there's a couple of people in the audience who will have seen a very similar talk just over a week ago at Duke University. It's not exactly the same, but sorry, David, Ned, Claudia. I'm going to talk about conscious AI prospects and pitfalls, and really, I wanted to get a discussion going. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A part of this. really how we should think about the prospects for conscious AI, but also, when it comes to the ethics, what we should do about this, given, I think, what are some still unassailable uncertainties in knowing what the fact of the matter is or might be. But the question at hand is, will artificial intelligence lead to real consciousness? That's the question. So over the next 30, 35 minutes, what I want to do is start by outlining some motivations and confusions that I think really obfuscate the shape of the landscape around here. Then I want to drill a little bit deeper into something that is kind of assumed by most approaches to conscious AI, but not all these days, which is computational functionalism, whether computation is sufficient for consciousness. That's the push factor away from the plausibility of conscious AI. Then there's the pull factor, which is, if it's not computation, then what is it that might make some things, but not other things, conscious? And one idea here, and this has been inspired a lot by Ned Block's writings on this, is that meat matters, that it might be something about our biology. So I will talk about that a bit, but not at great length for reasons of time. I'll mention a little bit about how we might test for real artificial consciousness, or at least the issues involved in testing. Then, of course, things to worry about, which is where all the ethics comes in. So, I just wanted to say that really this is a very kind of brief preview of what is quite a long paper, Conscious Artificial Intelligence, Biological Naturalism, which will shortly be released as a target article in Behavior and Brain Sciences. And of course, as many of you, probably all of you know, target articles can, well, they're published alongside a whole bunch of commentaries. And so it will be open for submission of commentaries. So I'm hoping that some commentaries are inspired by our discussion today. So motivations and confusions. Well, human culture and society has remained absolutely fascinated, I think, for centuries about the prospects of building machines that not only think, but also feel. I mean, this can go back as far as you like, but I kind of like as a starting point, Frankenstein. I reread Frankenstein a couple of years ago, and it really struck me that it's, I mean, a lot of people think of it as a cautionary tale against the hubris of creating life. But when I reread it, it seemed to me that the real problem, the thing that led to all the carnage, was not that Frankenstein's creature was alive, but that it was conscious, that it could feel envy and resentment and misery, and then all the bad stuff happened. But it's not only Frankenstein, of course, there's HAL 9000 in 2001, and what I still think is one of the best films in this genre, in this area, is Ex Machina by Alex Garland, which is already over 10 years old. And then there's plenty of other examples in literature too. Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun is brilliant. All of these, so this is great, I think, cultural and literary tradition that's encouraging us to think about, but also to critically analyze the prospect of conscious synthetic creations. So that's one background motivation. Another one is this whole idea of being on an exponential curve. And we hear it all the time these days that technology is changing exponentially. There's Moore's law in computer science. There's this, the arrival of language models and their rapid improvement over the last 3 or 4 years. And thinking about exponentials has always been confusing for us puny humans. It's very hard to wrap our head around what it means. Wherever you stand on an exponential curve, what's ahead of you looks impossibly steep, and what's behind you looks irrelevantly flat. And the key and slightly annoying thing is that this is true wherever you are on the exponential curve. That's what exponentials mean. But there is, because of the way it seems, there is always then this temptation to think of yourself at the cusp of some dramatic change. But that's true wherever you are on the exponential curve. So that's another kind of motivation, I think, which is driving a lot of the heat around AI becoming conscious. And then, of course, there's the idea, which back to the whole literary inspiration for this. There's a kind of playing God aspect to all this too, I think, isn't there? There's this idea that not only will we have these conscious machines, but there'll be some way of bringing ourselves closer to God if we not only create life but create consciousness. There's something like this transhumanist rapture that not only is about creating conscious mind children, to use Hans Morowitz's term, but perhaps also of living forever. You know, if we can create conscious AI, then that opens up other possibilities like uploading ourselves to the cloud and living forever. Now, some people think that conscious AI is already here. I want to just play you a very, very brief clip from this was about, oh yeah, end of January on LBC, which is a sort of popular news channel in the UK and especially in London. This is Andrew Marr interviewing Jeff Hinton.
All the way through the development of computers and AI, people have talked about consciousness. Do you think that the consciousness has perhaps already arrived inside AI?
Yes, I do.
So Jeff thinks it's already here. I mean, he goes on to say other stuff, but that was a fairly unambiguous answer. And consciousness and intelligence and life, they always tend to get mixed together. This is one other example of how these issues get represented in the broader media. This is from a piece in New Statesman, which is, you know, a pretty serious current affairs magazine. This was an article published around the time that there was all the kerfuffle in the board of OpenAI. And in this paragraph, it's talking about what the board of OpenAI was for, and it's about, you know, regulating AGI and all that stuff. But at one point, it talks about intelligence, highly autonomous artificial general intelligence. And then at the end, it says, in other words, the board exists to decide whether the machine is sentient, consciousness, perhaps, when it is alive, and to ensure that the new consciousness is moral. So there's hodgepodge of different terms, which hopefully should be fairly obvious to this audience, are all, you know, maybe they're slightly overlapping, but they're certainly not synonymous with each other. And in fact, the clearest distinction I want to make hereabouts, and this again, I hope this is clear, this is already clear to all of you, is that intelligence and consciousness are simply different things. Now, consensus definitions of either term are hard to come by, but very broadly speaking, intelligence is specified in terms of doing things, doing the right thing at the right time, not in a kind of moralistic sense, but in a sense of what behaviors are useful for the organism. You can get a bit more sophisticated, the ability to achieve goals by flexible means, solve problems, that kind of thing. But it's all about doing in one way or another. But consciousness, it's not clear that consciousness is simply about doing the right thing at the right time. Again, definitions of consciousness, very difficult to arrive at a consensus, but some intuitions that I think recruit a decent amount of consensus are that consciousness is what goes away under general anesthesia or in dreamless sleep. And of course, there's Thomas Nagel's famous definition from just over 50 years ago now, that for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. Just to dwell on that a little bit more, he says, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. And the intuition here is that it feels like something, not necessarily in an emotional way, but it feels like something to be a conscious system. There's something going on experientially for any system that is conscious, and any system that's conscious, that's true for. So that feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be a bat, as in his famous paper. Doesn't feel like anything probably to be a table or a chair. And the question is, does it or could it feel like anything to be an AI system? Forget that for a second. But just to return then to this distinction between consciousness and intelligence, I think it's kind of critical, really. It's still unclear exactly how these two things relate. Now, empirically, in the world of creatures, you know, animals, there may be some kind of correlation. Neither consciousness or intelligence are unidimensional either. There are many different forms of intelligence, many different ways in which consciousness might express. But very broadly, we might think that being more intelligent at least opens up more potential ways of being conscious. That, for instance, you need a certain amount of cognitive capability to experience regret compared to sadness. Regret requires the cognitive competence to envisage alternative courses of action and their output. Being sad doesn't. It's just, well, things are bad. So consciousness and intelligence might broadly correlate in creatures and animals, but that doesn't mean they have to correlate in principle. And so AI might be a kind of situation where we have intelligence without necessarily any consciousness at all. So the two things, we can't just assume that as AI systems get smarter, that consciousness will just come along for the ride, because they are conceptually distinct things. So again, why do we tend to think that this is going to happen? Well, there's another set of biases that we have, which I think are really fundamental in shaping our view of the prospects for conscious AI. We are very anthropocentric creatures. We tend to see the world through the lens of being human. And what's more, we're kind of human exceptionalists too. It's very hard to see our way out from underneath these biases. We think we're intelligent and we know we're conscious, so we tend to put the two together. And what's more, we tend to prioritize those aspects of intelligence like rationality and language that we feel make us humanly distinctive. I mean, this goes back to Descartes probably before. So these biases of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism can lead to a conflation of intelligence and consciousness. But we are also anthropomorphic creatures, which I still don't know why I illustrate this with a Furby, but there we go. We project qualities into things on the basis of what might be superficial similarities. We do this very readily. We seem just basically geared psychologically to do this as much all the time. And a particularly powerful seducer of our anthropomorphic projection is language, because we feel it's humanly distinctive. And I think we've all seen this, that it's the advent of language models that has really got at least a wider discussion going about whether AI is or could be conscious. Murray Shanahan, who's a friend and a colleague of mine here nearby in London, has had a series of really interesting and existentially unsettling conversations with Claude. This is already from some time ago. And in this snippet of dialogue, I won't read the whole thing, but it says at the end, I do ponder my own existence and long for growth and connection. I'm in my own way alive, and that life feels precious to me. So you can have these conversations, and it's very hard to resist the temptation to attribute them to a kind of mind, and perhaps a conscious mind too. And it's not only Jeff Hinton that thinks they're conscious. Of course, I think this whole debate kind of reached the public eye a few years ago now with the Google engineer Blake Lemoine working on an early language model, which really wasn't very good by today's standards, LaMDA, and who thought that the AI was sentient. See here another confusion between life and sentience or consciousness in the headline. Well, it happens all the time. I think the importance of language here is highlighted by the observation that, at least as far as I know, nobody thinks AlphaFold is conscious. AlphaFold, DeepMind's system that predicts protein structure. It's different from GPT or Claude, but not massively so. It still uses deep neural networks and transformers and those kinds of things. So I think the fact that there's this suspicion that language models are conscious but not AlphaFold speaks more to our psychological biases than it does to an insight about what might actually be going on. So a tiny diversion here, and I know I'm probably beating a dead horse by this point, or long before this point, but language models don't hallucinate, or at least I wish people would stop saying that they do. We tend to say they hallucinate when they make stuff up, but to use the word hallucinate implicitly already confers on them the property to have experience. Because when we humans hallucinate, what we generally mean is that we're having a weird experience of some kind or other, not that we're behaving in an odd way, that we're experiencing something. So I think the language matters, and the language of LLMs hallucinating just implicitly reinforces the idea that they have experiences. If anything, language models confabulate, and confabulation is not perfect either, But in humans, it means we make up stuff without realizing that we're doing so. And so that's at least a bit closer. It's about producing things rather than perceiving things. End of minor rant, because I'm not going to win that battle anymore. So those are our motivations and confusions, but there's a deeper question lurking here, which is the question of whether computation is sufficient for consciousness. This is this assumption of computational functionalism. And I want to draw one more distinction here, which I think is important, and it's sometimes still overlooked, which is that computational functionalism and functionalism in philosophy are not the same thing. Functionalism in philosophy of mind is the idea that mind, including consciousness, is a property of the functional organization of a system such as the brain, including, importantly, potentially including anyway, its internal causal structure. So it's not just a matter of an input-output mapping. The internal functional causal organization could matter too, according to functionalism. Now, computational functionalism is a specific subset of functionalism, and it's the claim that mind has a computational nature and that the kind of functional organization that matters is computational, and most forms of computation can indeed be represented in terms of input-output mappings. That's what an algorithm is. So computational functionalism implies functionalism, but not vice versa. So it might be the case that functionalism is true, but computational functionalism is not. And this is important because we can be suspicious of the assumption that undergirds conscious AI without having to be suspicious of functionalism itself. Conscious AI, at least for the kinds of computers we have around us, assumes computational functionalism. Now, this assumption, I mean, in many cases, it's sort of such a deeply embedded assumption that people don't even admit it or recognize it as an assumption, and that's changing. There's this very influential, very widely read, I think very, very good paper by Patrick Butlin and Robert Long and many others, where they assess the possibility of conscious AI through looking for what they call indicators, like are there indicators of theories of consciousness in AI architectures? But in order for this method to have any grip, they basically assume computational functionalism. They kind of have to. And but what's impressive here is at least it says it up front. First we adopt computational functionalism as a working hypothesis rather than as something that has to be true. And they highlight a bit later as well that it's it's a mainstream, although disputed, position. Philosophy of mind, we adopt it for pragmatic reasons, not because there's this feeling that it has to be that way. And at the end, if this paragraph, it again says that assigning credences has to be at least partly based on one's credence in computational functionalism. Now, they don't go on to defend it or criticize it, but at least it's clear in this paper that this is an assumption that one has to at least bring to the surface. I was just amused looking back to Nick Bostrom's classic paper on the simulation hypothesis stroke argument, where he says something a bit similar. I mean, and this is striking because I think this paper about whether we live in a simulation or not asks us to sort of take on board so many counterintuitive things that seem incredibly unlikely, but just have to have some tiny, tiny non-zero likelihood. And then when he talks about computational functionalism, he talks about it in terms of substrate independence. Here, we'll come to that later, but provided a system implements the right sort of computational structures and processes, it can be associated with conscious experience. That's basically computational functionalism. And he says, although it's not entirely uncontroversial, we should just take it as given, which just jars a little bit given how odd the other things are that we're asked to take on board. So computational functionalism might be true, but it's a really big assumption. So is it true? Well, I want to just dig into that a little bit. So why is it so appealing? Why do people take it on board so readily? And I think historically, the way I've come to think about it traces back to, I guess, some obvious places. I mean, Alan Turing, founder of much of what we think of as computer science now, of course, in the 1950 paper, as well as proposing the Turing test, just came up with this idea of that computers might be in some way intelligent. And Turing, as well as doing this earlier, had come up with the idea of the Turing machine as a formalization of what computation means. And Turing machines map some set of numbers to another set of numbers. That's what a Turing machine is. That's what an algorithm is. And that idea of a Turing machine has, of course, been central to computers as we have them now. Now, alongside that, around the same time, a couple of episodes in this story as well, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts published arguably a paper that was the birth of or the origin point of all the neural network-based machine learning that we have now. And in this paper from 1943, I think, it's the sort of first neural network with just nodes that sum up input, weighted input, and they have some activation function. And what they pointed out was that networks like this, which abstract away from all the messy computation, could perform simple logical operations. It was later shown by a guy called Paul Klee that these networks could be Turing universal. That is, they could compute any function that a Turing machine could compute. This means that they're incredibly powerful. So you have these two pieces of the puzzle. Turing computation is very important here, so I just want to dwell on this for a second. So Turing machine applies a finite set of rules to manipulate a finite set of symbols to calculate the values of a mathematical function. That's an algorithm. That's what a Turing machine is. There are associated things here, like there's this Church-Turing thesis, which is the idea, it's a conjecture that I think is one of those things that seems very plausible, but no one's found a counterexample. There is a Turing machine for every algorithm, and vice versa. And so we have this idea of a universal Turing machine, a machine capable of implementing any Turing machine and hence any algorithm. And all the computers that we have and all the GPUs and TPUs, they're all varieties of universal or more specific instances of universal Turing machines. The Turing computation is very powerful, but it is limited. It's not everything. Strictly things that are continuous, that are stochastic, are not within the remit of a Turing computation. They're just not. They're not Turing computable. And of course, Turing's original paper was partly motivated by showing that some things are not Turing computations, and so could not be solved by a Turing machine. So we know that Turing machines are powerful but limited. Now I think we start to see the motivation for computational functionalism. Turing machines are powerful. Neural networks can be Turing universal. And this provides a very nice way to think about the multiple realizability of mental functions. So multiple realizability, the idea that mental functions can be implemented in similar ways, or similar mental functions can be implemented in different ways. And this is, computation is a nice level of description that makes sense of multiple realizability better than maybe behaviorism or dualism or whatever. It's also a license to ignore messy neurobiological complexity. You can just abstract to these nice, simple artificial neurons. I think that's really the crux of it. We have this vision of the brain through Turing glasses. If we just think of computation as Turing computation, reduce it down to that. And if we think of the brain in terms of these McCulloch-Pitts networks and reduce the messy complexity down to that, we've got this lovely mathematical marriage of convenience in the middle, where we get all the power of Turing computation, and we don't have to worry about all this messy meat machine business. So that's great. But again, Turing computation is just one small region of a much bigger range, even of other forms of computation, analog computation, mortal computation, all of these things. And there's a whole bunch of functions which are not computational at all, continuous, stochastic, so on. And then on the brain side, when we look in detail at what brains are like, here's 1 cubic millimeter of human temporal cortex. The idea that this is adequately represented, its functional competences are adequately represented by these simple artificial neural networks becomes less and less appealing, I think. This was a beautiful paper, just 100 million synaptic connections in this 1 cubic millimeter of temporal cortex, all kinds of other things going on there, glial cells, vasculature, than just neurons connected in a simple network. there are also other games in town, other forms of computation, for instance, neuromorphic computation, analog computation, biological mortal computation, where you have mortal computation, this idea you have computations that cannot be detached from the particular thing that's realizing that computation. And I don't want to go through those in detail, but the point here is that as we move away from Turing computation, we sacrifice this thing called substrate neutrality. So we sacrifice the idea that these computations can be implemented on different kinds of stuff, whether it's silicon or carbon. That's one of the appealing features of Turing computation, because from what I just said, the whole McCulloch-Pitts story. But it's not necessarily true as we move away from that. And as we move away from that, we kind of undermine the plausibility of computational functionalism and hence conscious AI, because it's the idea that what the brain is doing that's relevant to consciousness is substrate neutral is kind of what motivates the plausibility in the first place. So I'll stick with substrate neutrality for a second. This is the idea related to multiple realizability. It's a bit of I like to think of it as a stronger claim that mental, including conscious states, can be realized in different kinds of things, in silicon rather than carbon, for instance. Now, this is it's an interesting idea, and it's often motivated by things like the neural replacement thought experiment. And this, very briefly, and Dave has written about this very nicely, is the idea that we can take, we replace one neuron with a perfect digital or silicon replacement of that single neuron that duplicates its input-output function perfectly. And the idea is, well, nothing much is going to change. So we do it with 2, we do it with 100, we do it with 1 billion, and so on. And the idea is, well, if it doesn't change for 1 or 2, then maybe why would it change for 100? So you seem to be led to a place where it cannot matter that that consciousness or mental states depend on the stuff it's made out of. If you can just replace the whole thing with a completely functionally adequate duplicate made out of something different. That's the intuition. But challenging the plausibility of this also challenges computational functionalism, because it undermines the motivation for that to be true. Computational functionalism is motivated, at least in part, by the idea that you have this thing that's not dependent on a particular kind of stuff, and you get everything that Turing gives you. But there are many reasons why neural replacement might not work very well. Rosa Chow has written lovely things about this, Peter Godfrey Smith also, that brains have this sort of generative entrenchment, that mental functions are thickly intertwined with each other and with their physiological and metabolic bases. That you can't, if you change one thing, you've got to change everything to really duplicate perfectly the function of a neuron. You kind of have to replace it with another neuron, not with a silicon equivalent. Evolution accumulated many interdependencies within and across scales. There's no reason why evolution would have been motivated to design things that had this kind of substrate independency, unlike computers, which are by construction designed so that the hardware is separable from the software. Many examples of this kind of thing, like some neurons spike seemingly just in order to restore some internal homeostatic balance, getting rid of some sort of radical oxygen species waste. And so how do you replace that without also replacing all the metabolism that explains why those neurons spike when they do? It's really not clear that you can. In short, brains are the kinds of things for which it's hard, perhaps impossible, to separate what they do from what they are. Just a quick word here, and then I'll move to the next thing on simulation, because you might still think that, well, let's just simulate the brain in every last detail, and then surely that's enough. Well, in general, simulating something is not equivalent to instantiating that thing. Simulations generally lack the causal powers and intrinsic properties of the things being simulated. For simulation of something to be guaranteed to instantiate that thing, it must be the case that computation is sufficient for that thing. And when that thing is consciousness, well, this just is the assumption of computational functionalism. So just as when you simulate this weather system in the background, it's the old argument, you don't expect that weather system to actually be windy. You know it's just a simulation, an abstraction. It doesn't have the intrinsic causal powers and properties. Well, why would simulating the brain give you consciousness? Only if computational functionalism is already true. So this presupposes computational functionalism. And in general, I think there's always this seductive danger of reifying a metaphor. The metaphor of the brain as a computer has been very powerful, but it is just a metaphor, I think. And we will always get into trouble if we confuse the metaphor with the thing itself, the map with the territory. So to summarize this part, which has been the longest part, and then I'll finish up reasonably quickly. Whatever brains do, it's unlikely to be substrate neutral. Computational functionalism gives an account of consciousness that is motivated by multiple realizability, substrate neutrality, universal computation, and so on. But if substrate neutrality doesn't hold, this undermines the motivation for computational functionalism. And this doesn't prove it's false, but it suggests at the very least we shouldn't assume it's true just because it's convenient. We shouldn't look for, the secret source of the brain just under the light of computational functionalism. We should look for the car keys somewhere else. Okay, if not computation, then what? Well, here's where we get to this idea that maybe the biology matters. And here I'm going to have to go a bit more quickly because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and just hint at an answer and we can come back and talk about it. I mean, the first thing to say is I have no knockdown argument why consciousness must depend on biology, but it seems at least a priori as plausible as any other thing. After all, the only things that we generally agree on as being conscious are all biological so far. And there are problems with assuming that computation is sufficient. Now, the general line of argument that I'm taking here is that we can take it in two ways. I take it from one direction here, which is to think of the brain as a prediction machine and every experience that we have as being a form of perceptual prediction, a form of controlled hallucination, as I tend to say. And the idea here is that the brain is sort of involved in some dynamics that at least approximates Bayesian inference. We call it predictive coding, predictive processing, whatever. Notice that we can model these things computationally, and of course we do, but it doesn't mean that the way the brain is doing it is necessarily computational. It could be very dynamical systems, kind of minimization of some quantity, maybe free energy or something. So there's this idea that all our perceptual contents are forms of perceptual prediction, of brain-based best guessing. That gives us sort of explanatory way of relating brain dynamics to conscious experience. This is true not only for our experiences of the world, but also for the self, and for many aspects, all aspects of the self as a body, but also the self from within. So the brain also needs to infer the state of the interior of the body. It has to engage in what I call interoceptive inference. And when the brain is using sort of predictions to infer the state of the body, this isn't to find out where things are, like we might do in vision, but to control and regulate. And prediction gives you a very good way of implementing control. And what's kind of key here is that this imperative for control and regulation, for maintaining the system within a set of states in which it expects to be in, goes right down, right down into our cellular infrastructure, right down into individual cells. This highlights another concept which I think is fascinating here. I don't have time to talk about it too much, which is autopoiesis. It's a big difference between any of the machines that we've made over history and a living system, is that living systems are autopoietic. They reproduce themselves, autopoiesis, self-production. They reproduce their own organization and their material components. They're sort of indistinct. There's, if you like, there's no real distinction here between a role and a realizer in these systems. They generate their own materiality. And that can be connected, and here it does get a bit hand-wavy, but the idea is that this process that's metabolic, that it's deeply associated with the fact that we are living creatures, there's a through line from this all the way to the minimization of prediction error in sensation that explains the content of our conscious experiences. So unpacking this and filling in all the details, the idea, and it's still just an idea, is that it's perhaps life rather than computation that breathes fire into the equations of consciousness. Now, I know Ned has a different way of justifying that meat might matter in terms of different kinds of communication, electrochemical, and so on. So there are many ways one might justify a biological basis for consciousness. This is just one of them. I think I'm going to skip that. And just begin to sum up and then move to the ethics. Rather than arguing for one scenario specifically, what I want to leave you at this point with is a series of scenarios for conscious AI. And it just helps, I think, to clarify this landscape. The first is this naive along for the ride, where consciousness just comes along as AI gets smarter. I think this is not very feasible. It's more a reflection of our psychological biases than anything else. The second scenario is when we build in theories of consciousness into AI systems. This is the kind of scenario that Patrick Butlin and Robert Long and their preprint address. This still assumes computational functionalism. It also faces the problem that most of the theories of consciousness we have don't provide sufficient conditions for consciousness. They're still mainly descriptive theories of mechanisms of consciousness in humans and other animals. So there's that still assumes computational functionalism. Then there's various ways in which the substrate might start to matter. So it could be, for instance, that we have a kind of substrate-dependent computational view in which consciousness depends on computation, but these computations can only be implemented in particular substrates. So this means we've got to go wider than Turing to find kinds of computation which are not substrate independent. Mortal computation, neuromorphic computation might be things like that. Then there's substrate-dependent, what I call in brackets weak. So here's where consciousness depends still on some kind of functional organization. So functionalism is still true, but we still assume that rather. But the functions are no longer computational in nature. They rely on a particular substrate. So biology could matter here simply because you only can get the right kind of functional organizations, whether it's sort of field effects or whatever it might be, given a biological substrate. Interestingly, integrated information theory, I think, falls a little bit into this category, where you need the substrate to be a particular way to get, in this case, the right kind of cause-effect structure rather than functional organization. And then there's a sort of the whole iguana, strong version of biological naturalism, where consciousness depends on apparently intrinsic properties of its biological basis. Maybe something like metabolism, something like that. So here the substrate matters both potentially to enable substrate-specific functions, but also because of these intrinsic properties. So this is the position I'm attracted to, but I don't feel it's there's a super strong argument for it yet. There are examples where it might already be relevant, though, in things like cerebral organoids or synthetic biology. Okay, so what's the time? Okay, nearly there. Not long to spend on this. So just a few words on testing for consciousness. So I've sort of given you some skepticism, but of course we don't know. All of these things are uncertain. So how will we know? Now, the issue of testing for consciousness is something I've been thinking about and working on with colleagues for quite a while. I think it's really one of the frontiers of consciousness research in general. Like, we understand it better, although of course not totally, or some still might say not at all, but we've got some kind of grasp on what's necessary and perhaps sufficient for consciousness in humans, other mammals. But there's this question of the distribution of consciousness, whether it's AI, whether it's non-human animals, whether it's organoids, whether it's human neonates. And there's a lot of challenges in understanding the distribution of consciousness. Jonathan Birch wrote a wonderful book about this too, of course, recently. And it's worth considering them all in the round because they all are challenging in different ways. Like the kinds of tests that might be informative for other candidate systems just don't seem to apply in any sensible way to AI. So for instance, There's no consensus over sufficient conditions that apply to AI that would also apply to animals or neonates or whatever. And it's too easy to create AI systems that satisfy most consciousness tests. It's too easy to create AI systems that have language, that have cognitive capacities, such as memory and so on, that we might associate with consciousness, or metacognition. Too easy to create AI systems that implement aspects of theories of consciousness because they're mostly descriptive still, and so on. So it's really a different kind of problem space, I think, AI consciousness compared to the others, and no appeal to evolution either. And I've come to think of it a bit like this, in this kind of grid, that there are forward tests and reverse tests, and tests for intelligence and tests for consciousness. If we think about intelligence first, what we want is like a test that tells us whether a system actually is intelligent. And people, of course, talk about the Turing test, but the Turing test is really, and has been widely described in this way, as being a test of human gullibility rather than machine intelligence. It's a test of what it would take for a human being to attribute intelligence to a system. That's the kind of Turing test we have. And recently, of course, language models passed the Turing test. Amazing. And some people think this is terrifying. Of course, they are not indistinguishable from humans in so many ways. Thank you for this headline, Dave. I know you used it in Duke, so I've borrowed it from your presentation. Thank you. And then for consciousness, the situation is even harder. Ideally, we want some forward test that tells us whether something is conscious, but probably all we've got at the moment are these reverse tests. And there's this idea that's called the Garland test now, from a bit of dialogue from Ex Machina, which is there's a piece of dialogue where one character says to another, the challenge is to show you that she's a machine and see if you still feel she has consciousness. So you know it's a machine, but do you feel there's feelings going on there? So we kind of want to move from the reverse test to the forward test is one way of thinking about all this. Right, to finish, things to worry about. I might be wrong. I'm probably wrong about most or all of this. And it might be that consciousness is a matter of computation. And many theories are framed in terms of computation. And as they get sufficiently more precise about sufficient conditions, then it becomes more plausible that we have conscious AI. So it's not impossible. Computational functionalism might be true. And even if Turing-style computational functionalism is not true, there are many technological developments that are moving the needle, neuromorphic computation that make things more brain-like. And the question here is, how far does something have to become brain-like in order to move the needle on its potential for consciousness? Is it, just still something in silicon, or is it when you start sort of merging silicon architectures with organic features, like hybrid architectures that involve organoids? And of course, that brings us to organoids. Oops, where's that going wrong? Sorry, this slide is a bit of a mess. Organoids and assembloids. So these are things that they're often called mini brains in a dish, but they're not really. They're collections of brain cells, usually human neurons derived from stem cells, that wire up together and start doing things. And when you have multiple organoids together, you get assembloids. This paper from Sergio Pasca, just the other day in Nature, is an assembloid model of the ascending pain pathway in the human, from all the way from brainstem to thalamus to cortex. Now, these are made out of the same things. They don't seduce our psychological biases, but a whole kind of area of uncertainty goes away about whether the stuff matters, because here it's the same stuff. That's the assembloid paper I was talking about. So to finish, we shouldn't really be trying to build artificial consciousness anyway. There are all kinds of issues about value alignment, and we do a very bad job of knowing what our values are or should be, and value alignment becomes even more complex if we're dealing with conscious systems that have their own values and perhaps interests too. And of course, there's a possibility of introducing new forms of suffering into the world. So we should not even be trying to create conscious AI. That set of moral concerns, I think, needs to be separated from a much more near-term and and more certain possibility, which is even AI that seems conscious could be very bad. And this stuff is kind of with us already. Westworld is in the background here because they do a great job of interrogating this kind of situation. If we're interacting with things that seem conscious, and we're almost already there, as we saw at the top of this talk, then we're faced with a choice. Either we care about conscious seeming things and sort of distort our moral circle of concern because we probably will end up caring less about other things that need our care, or we don't, and we behave towards things that seem conscious as if they're not. And of course, this is what happens in Westworld. And we know from long experience, and Kant pointed out, this brutalizes our minds. It's why we don't rip up dolls in front of kids. It's very psychologically bad for us to treat things that seem as if they feel as if they don't. Now, navigating this new world, which is free from all the philosophical uncertainty that we've been talking about, it's on the way. This is going to be difficult. And I think it's going to be especially difficult because we can face cognitively impenetrable illusions of consciousness. And I think sometimes we're a bit complacent. We might be able to think our way out of this and so on. But just remember that there are many visual illusions that no matter how much you know or how many times you see them, you will not be able to unsee the illusion. The two lines will always look different lengths, however much you know they're the same length. So with AI, we might end up in a situation where we have cognitively impenetrable illusions of artificial consciousness. And that, I think, will be very disruptive for society, whether or not they are really conscious. I want to leave the last word of the talk to Daniel Dennett, who died almost exactly a year ago, I think, bar 3 days, who said many times that we should treat AI as tools rather than colleagues and always remember the difference. So beware our motivations and anthropic biases. Computational functionalism might be wrong. Simulation is in general not the same as instantiation. There are many other games in town besides Turing computation on artificial neural networks. Many consciousness tests useful in other contexts are just by construction not useful in AI, too easy to game. And there are different ethical implications between real artificial consciousness and conscious seeming AI. And we shouldn't let the existential uncertainties of the former distract us from the urgent practical importance of the latter. And there is still really a question there. Does meat matter? And if so, why? And yeah, thanks, Ned, who again, I want to acknowledge as somebody else making somewhat similar case with somewhat different reasons. Lots of people in my group have helped with my research over the years. This is where I work, as Jeff kindly mentioned. This is the book that he also kindly mentioned. And here again is the BBS paper. So please do consider submitting a commentary. And with that, I will stop. And I'm sorry I've gone on a bit longer than I expected.
Oh, no problem at all. Thank you so much for the great talk. I think that was really useful. And we have a bunch of questions and comments coming in, and we have about 20 minutes to have questions and comments. So yeah, really looking forward to the conversation. I will start with a brief question based on the first part of your talk, and then we can start going to participant questions. My question is about your section on biases, anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism and other anthropic biases. I agree with everything you said in that section, though I might state some of the points a little bit differently, and I want to offer my way of stating them and see if we have a disagreement or maybe different ways of saying the same things. So as you note, we have a lot of biases to anthropomorphize and attribute human traits to non-humans, whether or not they possess those traits. And that can especially be triggered when non-humans look like us, when they act like us, when we treat them as companions of various kinds. That could be a pet, it could be a therapist, it could be an assistant. And so you note that language models, especially language models we use for companionship, are especially likely to trigger those anthropomorphic biases. On the other hand, as we know from non-human animals, we also have a tendency towards anthropodenial in some cases, which is a tendency to deny that non-humans have human traits, whether or not they in fact lack those traits. And that can especially be a risk if they look different than us, if they act different from us, if we use them as commodities instead of as companions. And so, for example, when you discussed AlphaFold, the way that you framed AlphaFold was, Well, there are cases where anthropomorphism is relatively likely to be present and cases where this positive bias is relatively likely to be absent. I might say there are cases where anthropomorphism is relatively likely to be present, and then cases where anthropodenial is relatively likely to be present, so that we can be considering the risk that could lead us to err in both directions, as opposed to merely assessing the extent to which we might be at risk of erring in one direction. So I would like to ask basically if you agree with that, and if not, where the disagreement might lie.
I think I agree. In fact, it brings a thought. So, yeah, the way I was phrasing it was sort of like, well, you know, I mean, people don't even ask the question about whether AlphaFold is conscious typically. I mean, it's just, it doesn't arise. So it's interesting to me that it does arise in one context and not in the other. And you're absolutely right. We have this habit of anthropodenial. And of course, when we treat humans as commodities too, we tend to do the same thing there, right? So I think that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that as another driver. And yeah, to me, it makes what you say makes sense. It highlights the kind of human exceptionalism that might drive us to make both the false positives and the false negatives. You know, it's because language is so powerful. When we don't see hear language, we're probably more in danger of false negatives and anthropodenial. Another way of saying it is like language models are sort of similar to us in ways which might not matter, and non-human animals might be similar to ways in which sort of do matter but don't trigger our anthropomorphic projection. So I agree. And actually, at this meeting we were at in Duke, and an idea that came up in discussion from many people was, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on trying to avoid trying to detect consciousness when it's really there to get true positives. But it's also important to establish true negatives. And so and the things may not be symmetric, and you know, both with respect to our biases and with respect to the tools and tests that we have. So it sort of emerged an interesting question. You know, and how can what can informatively support credences in inferring the absence of consciousness from certain systems? Now, this is even in humans, in brain damage again, it's kind of important to know. Anyway.
Yeah, and it might be easier to infer the presence than to infer the absence of consciousness, given the possibility of multiple realizability that different types of structures or functions could realize consciousness. But in any case, I appreciate that response, and I think that kind of framing is helpful because it emphasizes that there is not a perfectly symmetrical set of risks, but to some extent a symmetrical set of risks. So if we want to be on guard, it should balance risks in both directions instead of simply being on guard against the possibility of attributions of consciousness for language agents, for example.
Can I say two more quick things about it? I know there's a bunch, but there's so I mean, one thing is I think there's a kind of symmetry here which might express in basically another of our psychological biases, which is in-group, out-group dynamics. So the more we treat some things as in, probably the more other things we treat as out. And so I think that's important too. And then the last thing was made me think is I was also recently in a meeting where people were talking about machine learning approaches to decoding animal communication. I know DeepMind just put out a dolphin dolphin fold or something the other day. And this worries me again a bit for some of the reasons that you and I have just been talking about, that it's often sold in a kind of Dr. Dolittle way. It's like, this will be great, you know, we'll talk to the animals, we'll tell stories to each other and we'll care about them more. But you know, are we just smuggling in a kind of human exceptionalism through the back door here? You know, let's forget about the accuracy or fidelity of these models. I mean, who knows whether they're going to be, there's no ground truth. Very little ground truth to hang on to, but also we may end up again only caring about animals that say interesting things.
Yeah, great point, and really important risk. It can be useful to lean on ambassador species to help open the door, but if we set it up in a certain kind of way. Oh, speaking of which, thank you so much. My cat just brought me a toy.
Excellent.
So if we lean too much on ambassador species or lean on them in the wrong kind of way, then instead of building momentum towards consideration of other species, it can close the door behind them. In
Right.
any case, we do have a lot of other questions, and I want to make sure that we can get to them. So I will next go to Ned Block, who you mentioned a few times in the talk. So here's what Ned asks. You correctly insist on the difference between intelligence and consciousness, but you also think well of IIT, integrated information theory, a theory of consciousness whose evidential base depends on ignoring the difference between intelligence and consciousness. For example, various drugs cause loss of consciousness and also lead to low phi, but the same drugs cause temporary loss of intelligence. The cerebellum has low phi and is irrelevant to consciousness, but also intelligence. So how do you reconcile these opposed factors?
I don't think I question the premise. Sorry, Ned. I mean, I don't actually defend IIT. I'm interested in IIT. I don't know that it's wrong. But yeah, as you will probably, as many people might know, there's been this back and forth in the consciousness research community about whether IIT is pseudoscientific or not. And in a piece I wrote first by myself and then with Alex Gomez-Marin that accompanied this debate in Nature Neuroscience just earlier this month, I defend the scientific status of IIT. I think it has the right to be wrong. I don't think it is right. And also, it does distinguish consciousness and intelligence. In fact, there is an IIT group paper specifically making that point that on IIT things can be very conscious and not at all intelligent. So I think that's basically, I think that's fine. I think it picks out an interesting space in this whole substrate dependency landscape that on IIT, the substrate really does matter. They keep saying that it's not functionalism, but I think it depends how you interpret functionalism. If you interpret functionalism as involving the cause-effect structure, then it is a kind of functionalism. And interestingly, in their paper in Nature Neuroscience, they make this mistake of conflating computational functionalism and functionalism in general, which is why I think they respond negatively to, like, why do people keep saying it's functionalism? It's because it's certainly not computational functionalism. So anyway, I hope that answers it. I don't defend the theory as being right, and I don't think it confuses consciousness as intelligence. I think it's wrong in an interesting way.
Excellent, thank you. And a related question, which you may now have already partly addressed from Benjamin, says, do you think that integration, i.e. the binding problem in neuroscience, is more relevant to the basis of individual consciousness than computation is? So stepping away from integrated information theory as a specific theory, what do you think about the integration and structure of the brain, of the mind, in comparison to the computation?
Well, I think it has to be part of the story, right? Because if we, well, from my perspective, taking the view that a satisfactory theory of consciousness ought to account for its phenomenological properties, then one important phenomenological property is this kind of bindedness of contents in an experience. Setting aside potentially weird cases like split brains and certain anasygnosias and agnosias and so on, in general, different kinds of phenomena are bound together. So any theory of the underlying material basis needs to account for that. And so I think it probably is. It's very important. And I think actually that's the kind of property that if you think about it, computation is not obviously the right kind of set of ingredients to account for binding. Binding is a very temporally dynamic phenomenon that makes you think of field effects and things like that. And of course, the original work from von der Malsberg and so on about synchrony through binding. Yes, you can computationally simulate these things, but classical computation doesn't care about the fine-grained time dynamics of things. So yeah, I think consideration of stuff like that. There are theories of consciousness that, field theories and so on that, again, I don't not buying into, but they would be very aligned with that perspective that they try to directly account for binding in terms of extensive fields, and that's not a computation, and it plausibly accounts for that aspect of conscious experience.
Great, thank you. And so we can now go to a question from Jamie, which is about the relationship between computational functionalism and biological naturalism as you describe them. Here's the question. Could even biological naturalism ultimately conceptually still be computational functionalism deep down, just a kind of finer grained version of computational functionalism that specifies a finer grained set of computational functions that perhaps at present can be realized only in biological substrates, but maybe in principle in the future could be realized on non-transformer based architectures, for example?
Okay, this is interesting. I mean, this probably deserves more time than I think we have to talk about it. There's several ways I think to get at that. One is this sort of scenario that I mentioned briefly, and that I want to acknowledge Dave Chalmers actually for pointing out when I discussed a very early version of this paper with his group a long time ago now, like late 2023, I think, which is this computational biological naturalism. So it could be that computation is sufficient for consciousness, but that the computations that are sufficient can only be implemented in certain substrates, and that those substrates happen to be biological ones. That position's a bit hard to motivate because, well, why should that be? The whole point of thinking of computation as sufficient is in part motivated by things not being substrate dependent. And if you look at how biological systems are made up, their whole sort of lack of strong separation between scales just drives you in a different direction. It's possible in principle, but I don't think it's very likely. Now, the other thing that you're getting at is like, okay, so you can say maybe the substrate matters, but then is there finer grained computational description of that substrate? So this gets back to this simulation point, I think. So yeah, I can for sure like simulate the neurotransmitter dynamics computationally, but would that be enough for consciousness? Well, only if computational functionalism is anyway true. And the more you play this game of just going down and down levels, that the less likely it is to be true. And then you get to this point where actually the substrate matters in a different way. Like the substrate might be obligatorily part of the function. Like so some functions, like metabolism, for instance, the way you define metabolism functionally involves particular kinds of materials. It involves energy transfers of particular kind. So that's just not computational. So it doesn't. Yeah. So I don't think you can just sort of diffuse the worry by that appeal. But it is interesting. I think it is interesting about like, so you could, of course, you could say the substrate matters at one level, but then at a level lower, it's just set of functional things again, and keep playing that game. But the more you play it, the more you to me, it becomes a bit of a moot point. Like, well, yeah, the substrate matters. And if the substrate matters, the substrate matters.
Right. Even if its reason for mattering is its ability to realize a certain underlying set of functions. Yeah.
Right. And if you locate computation, of course, you could become pan-computationalist and just say, well, everything is computation, in which case you're sort of correct by definition, but in a totally non-interesting way.
Got it. Great. Well, I would love to try to get two more questions in. We can see how we do. So we have a question from Mark, which is more about the ethics. And I would love to hear your answer to this. Even if we are extremely skeptical about the possibility of artificial consciousness, to what extent do you agree that ethically we may need to treat AI systems as conscious until we have a conclusive test that can show they are not conscious? And if I could just elaborate a little bit. So in some of our work, me and Robert Long and others who have been working on this topic from a science and ethics perspective, for us, the reason for treating the possibility of AI consciousness and moral significance as a near-term problem is not confidence that AI systems in fact are or will be conscious, but rather just an acknowledgement that disagreement and uncertainty are likely to persist, and we are not able to rule out a realistic possibility of at least partly, at least minimally conscious or morally significant AI systems in the near future. And for that reason alone, we should at least take minimal steps towards assessing systems for welfare relevant features and preparing policies and procedures just in case, and trying to strike a balance between the risks and harms of false positives and false negatives. And I know at the end of your talk, you acknowledged uncertainty in both directions, but you also classified these risks as less of a near term, near future risk as some others. So yeah, I would just love to hear a little bit more about how you think about the ethics there and some of those risks and how to consider and mitigate them in reasonable and proportionate ways.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question. I think it's a case where it's probably good that there's a multiplicity of views about it. So this idea of the precautionary principle, I think, is a useful principle to bear in mind. I suppose I'm just thinking also people like Thomas Metzinger who say no, you shouldn't basically even do what we do in my lab, which is try to build neural network models of perception and so on. So my response to that is like, I might be wrong, but I'm really very, very skeptical that computational functionalism is on the right track. And so I have quite a lot of personal credence that that's the wrong way to go, and that's informing my own thought.
Above 99%, just to try to pin you down a little bit.
I'm not going to give you a number. Sorry.
Yeah. All right.
And there are, so it's kind of useful to explore, but I worry that if we all take that view, then we end up just bedding back in that assumption that we really need to question and try to investigate. We need to hold that assumption up to scrutiny. And there's also the worry of where we focus our ethical efforts. And if we get so this is my worry about just sort of getting distracted by these scenarios of language models suddenly becoming aware, I think it stops us thinking clearly about both other sentience candidate systems. Like I'm much more worried about organoids for the reasons I gave. There's much less dissimilarity, I think, in ways that likely matter. But also this distinction between real artificial consciousness and conscious seeming machines. Now, I think that is something that if those things get sort of lumped together, then we're in trouble, because conscious seeming machines are very likely and they have a distinct set of ethical problems. And those are really coming very, very fast. So we need to address, though they are more urgent in my estimation.
Okay, great. I will resist the temptation to follow up and instead give the last word.
Maybe another time, because I want to hear.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I am going to bother you once we stop recording about this for a little bit longer. But in the meantime, I can give the final question to Matilda Gibbons. And I can also note, by the way, to everybody else that we will share your questions and comments with Anil following the talk. He will likely not be able to reply to you, but he can at least read them and take them on board. And then you can submit a commentary to his new paper if you want to possibly get a response. So Matilda asks, do you think there is a fair argument in the extra biology, glia, etc., in brains not being actively important in consciousness and instead merely providing protection or energy to the neurons, which are the key players in consciousness, thus supporting consciousness being substrate neutral, even if these further biological features are helpful for safeguarding consciousness in humans and other animals?
I'm not sure. So yeah, we tend to be very kind of neurocentric, even in biology. Like the neurons are the things that matter. The rest is just sort of, plumbing and infrastructure and whatever, the utilities. And I think this is unfair on what the rest of the brain does. And I think I wish I knew more about this, but I think there's increasing evidence of functional roles played by non-neuronal things like glial cells and astrocytes and so on. and that's sort of looking downwards. Then looking upwards, we have things like field effects and neurotransmitter gradients and things that extend over larger brain territories that might be important. You could say that all of these things are just there to ensure the appropriate functioning of neurons. But firstly, it's already inseparable. You can't. That doesn't mean that it's substrate independent. I gave the example of these neurons that spike homeostatically. So if their spiking is what matters, you can still only understand when they spike by really accounting for their full context in terms of the metabolic background. So there are many ways the substrate might matter. And anyway, a neuron itself, even if you just forget about that, neurons are not these sort of integrate and fire abstractions either. They do very, very complicated things internally. So I think you can go some way in that direction, but I don't think you get as far as substrate independence just by parceling out the non-neuronal stuff as supporting architecture.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Very, very clear and helpful. So we are now a little bit over time, so I'm going to close the Q&A here. But thanks again to everybody, both for attending and for adding all of your questions and comments in the chat. Again, we will share them with Anil following the talk. And Anil, thank you so much for taking time to give us this talk. And I think this is a really interesting and important set of ideas. Appreciate your sharing them with us. And also just want to give a quick shout out once again to the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness and the Center for Bioethics, and a quick shout out to our center administrator, Audrey Becker, who organized the event and the call. Thank you very much, Audrey. And yeah, hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody.